In chapter 6 of We Who Wrestle with God, Peterson turns to the biblical story of Abraham, and the chapter title is Abraham, God as Spirited Call to Adventure. So, Andrew, please take us through this chapter, if you would.
Yeah, all right. So we were talking about this before the episode and before we began filming, and this is essentially the penultimate passage or penultimate chapter. This is I've noted, I think, every single episode so far that there's this running tally that I'm keeping of all the times he's mentioned Jacob's ladder. Well, this is the chapter where he talks about the story of Jacob's ladder. So, like, this shows up. This is also Abraham, which is the story that he defines as God being the voice of the call to adventure, which, if you'll remember, that's the first definition he gives of God, or the first characteristic he gives of God in the preface. And I think it's like Roman numeral 19 or something. But so essentially, this kind of is the chapter that everything that he is concerned with really kind of comes to the fore, right? This is all the metaphors he's been using and so forth are kind of coming to a head here. Now, the wonderful thing is he opens this chapter to help us kind of gain an appraisal of where we are by saying that, by the way, this is the 6th chapter and we have 5 definitions of God that we've gone over so far, and he lists them for us. So it's just useful to have that right there. The first one is that God is the creator of a good order from out of chaos. So that would be the first chapter, the creation chapter. Second chapter teaches us that God is the spirit of unself-conscious existence in the heavenly garden. The third one is that God is the proper target of sacrifice. That's the Cain and Abel chapter. The fourth one is that he is the voice compelling the wise to prepare for the storms. That's the Noah chapter. And then the 5th would be the one you just went over, which is the foe, that God is the foe of prideful tyrants. And so we have all of those definitions, and now we come to God as the voice of inspired adventure. And in every single one of these definitions or characteristics of God that he has given so far, the notion of sort of we can ascend or choose the lower way has defined every single choice that he is advocating. That's, with the chapter that we just went over, the Tower of Babel, not Babylonians, but the people at Babel are choosing the lower way. They're choosing not to follow the unifying spirit of the Creator. And so here we have the fullest example of the kind of adventure that Peterson is hoping to call his reader to. There are several places as well where he kind of breaks with his exposition and straightforwardly talks to the reader and says, "Are you doing this?" Which is a really, really great way to sort of keep you connected with what he's talking about. So the first part, 6.1, is titled "Go Forth," and he starts off with a reading of Abraham. And if you've listened to his podcast very much, you'll be very familiar with what he's about to say here, because he repeats this point often. He says that Abraham was a bit of a privileged and comfortable kind of man-child in essence, and this he is then called out of this by God to, quote, found something of lasting worth, end quote. Right? This is, I think, the second page of the chapter. So, yeah, that's page 242. And this founding something of eternal worth or of lasting worth is essentially the entirety of his focus here. And it's always mediated by the notion of the family, by the notion of maturing, and then maturing to also produce a rich, and you could even really say in a, I think, kind of literary way, a royal line of descendants, right? And in essence, the kind of, maybe not subtle, but the kind of undercurrent of the whole chapter is a concern with how are we raised, how do we grow up, how do we mature. It is a story of maturing. And so to begin with, we are called to adventure, but there is no greater adventure, he says, than the adventure of living in the truth. He says that on page 244. The truth is the greatest adventure. Sorry. And the greatest adventure here of living in the truth is contrasted with living, I would think pretty obviously, in a lie. And if you've just come out of the chapter on the Tower of Babel, what are they living there? They're living a lie, in essence. They're living this humanistic, secular humanistic kind of lie. And so he makes a really, really great point a little bit later, actually a few pages later, page 253, where he says that Abraham is called out of Canaan. And where is Canaan if not the place that Cain, in essence, dominated, his descendants or filling that land? And so Canaan is in a drought. And Peterson points out, and I love this point, Peterson points out that, of course, the land of Cain would be in a drought. Why? Because the curse that God gives Cain is that the land will not sustain him. He will be cursed to be a wanderer, and that he is not permitted to stay in any one place. Now, of course, in the story, what does Cain do? He immediately builds a city, and in a way that Jacques Ellul talks about, Cain is actually the founder of the city. Cities exist by the lineage of Cain. And so, of course, there'd be a famine there. In a way, Cain was directly disobeying God when he did this. And so Abraham is called out of this. And while there's a kind of faux commitment, or not commitment, a kind of faux protection that comes from this, what's ultimately not the case is that it's any kind of real or true safety. And so Peterson actually has a really great point. I don't think it's in this section. I forget the subsection it's in. But he has this really great point where he talks about how in Russia, for example, fairly recently, even still in history, the Soviet Union fell. So there's still plenty of people that grew up in the Soviet Union or that know the Soviet Union. And he makes the point that in statistics, it shows that a lot of them actually look back on the Soviet Union with even a kind of contentment and maybe even a fondness. And of course, he links this to the children of Israel making it out of Egypt and saying, looking back and saying, well, at least in Egypt, we had food, right? And he's saying that the problem is when you're called into the adventure, it's oftentimes the case that you'll look back on your worst situation that you came out of and you'll wish that you were back there because you have this kind of overly idealized view of the past that doesn't have any kind of concrete reality. Because as he notes with those statistics, the older people that are polled by, I think it was Pew, I want to say, that did the polling, the older people that were polled that maybe even remembered Stalin, for example, that they viewed Stalin more favorably than who was president when the Soviet Union fell? Was it Gorbachev? It was Gorbachev, wasn't it? Yeah, so they viewed Stalin more favorably than Gorbachev. Now, if you look at the history of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev was a teddy bear by comparison to Stalin. Like Stalin's a guy that killed tens of millions of his own people, for crying out loud. Gorbachev has nowhere near that kind of an identity. And so to look back on Stalin in that kind of more favorable way shows a strange bias for just a perceived place of security. And the reality is, if you were growing up under Stalin, there was no security. But at least when that order that you were growing up under was sustained, there was a kind of order. It's a lesser order, but there's a kind of order. And so when you move from that order to create a better order, to, in a sense, sacrifice the old order and turn to a new one, the point ends up being that this is going to be an incredibly, even terrifying movement that you're going to engage in. But it's worth it because the truth, living in the truth rather than some faux society that is a lie, is ultimately far the better way to live. Now, Peterson then turns to his notion of sacrifice. This shows up throughout the entirety of the chapter, and it's been showing up throughout multiple chapters. If you go back to chapter 3 on work, you'll remember that sacrifice is an integral part of work. Even the definition of work is, in essence, that you're doing the thing that you would prefer not to do, and that you're not following your passion. You're not doing your passion. You're doing the thing that isn't your passion. That's why you get paid for it. And so the definition of work even contains a sense of sacrifice. And so there's essentially this motif that pops up here, which is that that maturity requires greater and greater sacrifice, and that the greater the sacrifice, the greater the reward. And then furthermore, what sacrifice looks like is that there are these older things that may have helped you in a moment, but they're now outdated, and you've outgrown them, and you must sacrifice the older to make way for the new. And this sense of sacrifice that Peterson's pointing out really ends up defining Abraham's, I shouldn't say Abraham yet, he's Abram at this point, Abram's journey. Now, he says on page 252 that this is ultimately characteristic of the pattern of individual development, and that's really what the chapter is about. And that's really just, again, that point of maturity requires sacrifice. So, moving on to 6.2, the next part at subsection of the chapter, it's called "The Devil is at the Crossroads." Now, I don't mean this is a kind of hermeneutic gripe. He basically says that Satan is waiting at every crossroads, because every crossroads gives you the option of either ascending and following the divine way or going lower and following the fallen way. And so Satan is greeting you there, trying to push you toward the lower way. Now, here's the thing. He illustrates this by Abraham and Lot splitting ways. Abraham and his nephew Lot go out on this journey together, but then eventually they split and go in two different directions. And Peterson says the principle we need to learn from this is that the people that we begin our journeys with will inevitably, we'll part from them at some point. But the point is, though, then we have to recognize that we will find ourselves at that crossroads, and we can choose the higher way or we can choose the lower way, but that Satan is always there greeting us at the crossroads. Now, as a point of exegetical critique here, I don't want this to be sort of meant in like a discrediting way. Satan is not in the story, right? If you read the Bible, Satan is not in the story. So this is a pure Petersonism, right? This point is not being drawn from the story, but is being rather eisegetically read into the story. And so Satan stands at the crossroads, but this ends up still being a pretty nice way of putting it, because there's a lot of symbolism that's at work in this movement. And Peterson is able to capture really the totality of that symbolism in that one statement. Satan is meeting you at every crossroads. Because Abraham goes to the west, Lot goes to the east. And there's, just in brief, here's sort of what that symbolizes. When Cain is kicked out of the garden, the statement is made that he was kicked out into the land of the east, or the land of Nod, which translates to the land of wandering, right? Or rather, it's east of Eden, right? That he's kicked out into. The implication as well for Adam and Eve is they're kicked out in the same direction. And so you can kind of see that the east represents a kind of worldliness, but it also represents a kind of non-garden, right? In a sense, the antithesis of the garden. So when Lot sees the east and decides to go east, where is he going, right? He's going in that worldly way. He's going in that non-garden way. And Abraham goes west. Well, what would west be? West would be in a direction returning to the garden, right? And so the fact is that even in the directions that they choose, you can see that Lot is already, in Peterson's way of putting it, following Satan, right? He's following the urge of Satan there. And so Lot goes into the land of the east, which is the land of Sodom and Gomorrah. And of course, he gets immediately taken prisoner by some of the kings there. Abraham has to come and save him. And there's this wonderful moment in the story where the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah come to Abraham and they offer to give him a ton of wealth. And so you can see that the allure of the East is essentially manifesting itself here, right? It's saying quite literally, here is all the wealth that we can offer you. Peterson doesn't make this connection, but I'm thinking of, if we want to continue with the Satan stands in the crossroads moment, think of Jesus in the wilderness when Satan comes to him and says, hey, here are all the kingdoms of the world. I will give them to you. There's a kind of similarity there in that passage. And so Abraham, though, following the calling of God, recognizes that that would be moving toward exactly the direction he's supposed to be moving away from, right? And so he's not following God's calling, and so he refuses to have anything even to do whatsoever with Sodom and Gomorrah, and moves back into his journey. Now, that's 6.2, moving into 6.3. We have this section where Peterson stops so much talking about the story of Abraham per se, and he starts moving into a kind of Petersonian trope, if you will. And it's a great trope. It basically, first off, it's sort of more of an elaboration on 6.3, his life as a sacrificial succession. And so he's making more explicit that point of sacrifice that I've already mentioned. And he also, though, notes the kind of selflessness that is necessitated by all of this. But I do want to highlight one thing outside of this, because most of it's sort of a repetition from what we've already heard. But I do want to highlight one thing, that he does actually give us his definition of a covenant. And I think it's pretty good, right? He gives a covenant. So for those of you who maybe haven't had a lot of theological training, covenants it's a huge term for Protestant theology. And if you go to Reformed theology in particular, guys like Calvin, Turretin, and whatnot, Robert Rollock, the Westminster Confession, the covenant is one of the most important terms in our theology. And so a lot of times it's even called covenant theology for that very reason. And so covenant, when Peterson's going to define what he understands by covenant, automatically as a Protestant, I got antenna that go up and go like, all right, what are you going to say here? Right. So he says on page 268 that, quote, what precisely is a covenant? A contract between two parties who agree to undertake or refrain from undertaking certain acts, a contract, compact, deal, or bargain. This is a perfectly sufficient definition of a covenant. And here's the thing. I would love to see him deal with that in greater detail, but the covenant that God makes with Abram is one of the most important theological covenants ever mentioned in the text. So there's in covenant theology, there's a series of covenants, and the Abrahamic covenant is pretty much just about the most important one. And so I don't know, I shouldn't say that. They're all most important ones. They're all together the most important one. But anyway, the point is, though, that God himself sacrifices a bull and puts Abraham to sleep, and then God passes between the two halves of the bull. And what this is pretty much just about universally understood to denote is that God is saying that Abraham does not have to fulfill his end of the covenant. God is saying, I and I alone will be the fulfillment of all of this. Again, this takes the burden of the work of this kind of salvation from Abraham and just rests now entirely on God's shoulders. And unfortunately, that doesn't really show up here in this chapter, but I think it's worth keeping in mind that the covenant here is the idea of when you sacrifice the bull is in essence that you cut it in half, and you're saying essentially when you pass through the two halves of the bull, may it be done to me if I fail to keep up my end of the bargain. And so this is God saying that, may I be literally slaughtered like this bull if I don't keep my promise here. And that is, I think, a profound moment in Scripture. Peterson's definition of a covenant is fine. I just wish it could then be connected to that part of the story. But this leads him, though, to point to a fundamental aspect of covenants is the selflessness that is implicit in the covenant. And this leads him into that Petersonian trope, which is his sort of attack of the notion of the selfish gene. And if you've read Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, you know pretty much what he's talking about. Overall, it's a pretty interesting book. There's a lot in it that's pretty interesting. If you know the term meme, I mean, that comes from Richard Dawkins in that book. So there's a lot of good stuff in it. But the fact is that it kind of ultimately produces a view of nature that's a bit like the Thomas Hobbes in the Leviathan has a famous line where he talks about it's the war of all against all, that society is essentially a competition of all against all. And if we are defined ultimately by selfish genes, that we're trying to get our genes into the future and really everything else is about our reproducing ourselves going into the future, then the fact of the matter is society is going to crumble pretty quickly. You can see from a Petersonian view that selfish gene would be a polytheistic kind of divinity that it would ultimately follow. And in the past episodes, when we've talked about the difference between monotheism and polytheism, the point is that monotheism is that you are unified under a hierarchy of spirits that leads you to the highest singular spirit at the top, determining all things. And a polytheistic spirit or set of spirits would be that you are lost to the chaos of too many cooks in the kitchen, right? You are lost to the chaos of too many determining forces shaping your existence. And so the selfish gene would make all of us, in a sense, our own kind of divinities going forward. And this leads into 6.4, what he calls sex and parasitism. And the chapter here, or this part of the chapter, again, has little to nothing to do with the story of Abraham, but it's a really good Petersonian point. He talks about this a lot on his podcast about how sexual selection really isn't just simply about genes reproducing themselves into the future. And it certainly is not in the last chapter you mentioned this. It certainly is not a kind of just sexual libertine kind of behavior, right? Which would make a whole lot of sense if we were operating in accordance with the selfish gene, right? That in fact, actually, there's a kind of sexual order that manifests itself. There's a better and a worse. There's a unified and there's a disunified order. And so Peterson launches into his critique of the selfish gene by discussing the practices of sexual selection, noting first that women choose men based on two features, really, competence and confidence. And so confidence, we all know what that one is, just intuitively. Competence, we kind of know what it is, but he says there's ultimately two features of competence. And these two features are, first off, intelligence that is generative and sacrificial. So it is a creative intelligence that also knows when to sacrifice the old for the sake of a greater new, right? Which would also be, it is selfless, would be a necessary entailment of that. And then the second one is, it is a willingness to abide by the contractual obligation that one enters into. So a covenant, right? It's a willingness to abide by the covenant. So when you get married, it's the covenant of marriage. And so there would be a willingness to abide by that, by the vow that you make before God. And in this chapter, as you probably picked up on in the last chapter, the Anthony that you were going over, Peterson, if you've grown up in the church and you've grown up hearing pretty regularly the kind of Christian sexual ethic, it's kind of, I don't mean this in a condescending way, it's almost amusing to hear somebody else, a major figure in society, finally actually saying the same thing as the kind of Christian sexual ethic that you grew up with. And so I was reading and thinking that, yeah, I've actually heard about every point that he's making here for the entirety of my life. And so he says, ultimately, the point is that good men engage in long-term rather than short-term mating practices, which, of course, would naturally be embodied in marriage, right? By what he says, I mean, I guess technically you could just, live with the person, never get married, and live with the person for a long-term strategy as well. But still, like, the point is ultimately best embodied in marriage. And he there's a line that I want to draw from Theodore Dalrymple. I think I've read this passage before on this channel, but it's Theodore Dalrymple's book, The New Vichy Syndrome. And he writes the following. He says, choice as a good in itself, even as the only good in itself, is now almost an unthinking orthodoxy in the West and affects everything from economic policy to medical ethics. Life is conceived as a vast supermarket through which one moves with one's shopping trolley, fetching down ways of life from the shelves marked existential choices. So if we think of the commodification of everything, in essence, along those lines, everything is ultimately just there as a commodity to be bought, to be enjoyed, to be consumed, in essence. And we're also guided by a misplaced understanding of the selfish gene. Then what we would see in terms of the sexual practices of our society would be that we would see everybody as just a means of sexual gratification. Basically, that's the entirety of the strategy, if you will. And so what we would be doing is we'd be sort of going down the supermarket being like, she's good. She's good. Just sort of picking at random ones that I would think would be satisfying in a sense, ones that would allow me to pass on my genes into the future. And that would be the sort of libertarian sexual ethic that's sort of taken over the culture at the moment, the post-sexual revolution kind of spirit. And Peterson's point is actually that would make sense if we operated on the terms of a selfish gene. And so it's kind of a refutation of the selfish gene that the commodification of sex has been harmful, both specifically to women and children. He says that on page 275, that it's been profoundly harmful. And in fact, it shows the disintegration of the family, the breaking down of all of society, basically, can be really rooted to that one point. And so long-term mating strategies should ultimately, he says, then be preferred, and they should be, quote, devoted to God. He says that on page 278. Now, again, I couldn't help but smirk when I read that, because that's something you hear in church pretty regularly. So that's the point of that section. So we move from there into 6.5, sacrifice as the transformation of identity. And so he builds atop the same notion of sacrifice, and he moves back into the text here. And he notes that the covenant that God makes with Abram changes Abram from Abram to Abraham. But he also points out that this is, it's not just Abram being changed into Abraham, it's Sarai being changed into Sarah, and it's Jacob being changed into Israel. That there's this kind of transformation that's so radical and so profound that it changes the very identity of the person as typified in a name. And he notes then that because of this, it's proof that it's not a kind of Sisyphusian. There's the myth of Sisyphus where he's cursed to push a boulder up a hill or up a mountain. And as soon as he gets to the top, the boulder just rolls all the way back down, and he has to go back down and pick it up and push it up again, and then it's going to roll all the way back down, in which case there's no true progress. Progress is just going to reset to an ultimate regress, and you must do the same thing over and over and over again. Well, this is the eternal return of the same. And so he notes that this is not a Sisyphusian process precisely because the identity of the person has been changed. It's not like Abraham's going to now reset back to Abram at some point, but rather he has truly progressed. And so, and Sarah as well. So on page 283, he says that ultimately they have found themselves now properly embodied or properly subservient to the one monotheistic animating spirit. This also transforms Sarah. This also transforms Jacob. And this is where we also get into the Jacob's ladder portion, right? And Jacob's ladder is that passage that I've been pointing out, the running tally of these. Let me see what we're up to. All right, here we go. It's page Roman numeral 19, page 5, page 98, page 126, page 287, and page 293. Basically, are all these sections where he's talking about Jacob's ladder. And he continues to stress that this is sort of the ascent of Jacob toward what is heavenly, toward what is unified, and away from what is worldly and disunified. So this gets us into 6.6 with the angels in the abyss. And this is his treatment of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, here, there's a lot that goes on. I got to summarize it pretty briefly. But the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is one of the more shocking stories in the history or in the entirety of the Bible. And in essence, basically, Abraham has these angelic visitors. And he in essence, then is told that Sodom and Gomorrah are going to be wiped out. His nephew Lot is living there, and he's saying, "Wait, could we save? Like, would you destroy even the good people that might still live in the city?" And he bargains with God to save Sodom and Gomorrah, and he says, "Maybe if there's 100 good people left in that city, would you spare it?" And God says, "Sure." But the implication is, of course, there's not 100 good people, so it's not going to be spared. And so then Abraham says, "Well, what about 50? What about 10?" And it ends up coming down to the realization that nobody's good in that city anymore. The whole thing has been totalizingly evil. And so the only person worth saving is Lot and his family. And even Lot's wife, when she looks back at the cities as they're being destroyed, turns into a pillar of salt. Peterson makes a good point on this one that I'll get into in a second. But the story ends up having it that these guys are so wicked and so corrupt in Sodom that when the angels go to Sodom to get Lot out, the men of Sodom surround the house and they demand to be able to rape the angels that just showed up. And Lot then offers, in a sort of point that Peterson stresses is totally foreign to our modern way of thinking, that Lot offers his own virginal daughters to this crowd, basically, to sate them rather than sending these two guests out. And Peterson makes a big deal about how there's this Middle Eastern kind of point that there really wasn't in this time a police force that you could rely on to keep the people at bay. That instead, all you had was the person who decided to take you in and take responsibility for you as a guest. And so what Lot is showing is that he himself is taking the ultimate sacred responsibility of sheltering a guest very seriously at this moment. It still doesn't make sense to go that far with it to us today, but still it's indicative of the ancient culture at that time. But the question then ends up becoming this. Historically, Christianity has always said that the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah was multifold. If you go to Ezekiel, I believe it is, that it's referenced as being inhospitality, but also at the same time, the unmistakable sin that is just at the very forefront of the story is that it's a very homosexual mob, basically, that is there. And so homosexuality has been always associated with the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, in recent times, that has been very much downplayed and even critiqued among a lot of more, progressive Christians. And so, inevitably, what happens today is that the hospitality point is elevated and the homosexuality point is just denigrated or completely removed. And so Sodom and Gomorrah is condemned for being inhospitable, not for being gay. And the thing is, Peterson somewhat kind of tries to split the difference here. That he mostly goes with the inhospitality point, that Sodom is condemned for being inhospitable. But he also notes that the form of sexuality that they practice is a barren form of sexuality. And precisely because it is barren, it is inhospitable. And so there's a sense in which you could see him going both ways, but the main one, again, that he emphasizes is the hospitality, which, we could do a whole episode on that one, but I got to move to the final point, which is the pinnacle of sacrifice, subsection 6.7, which is Abraham being called to sacrifice Isaac. And he says here, I think in the penultimate point, that here we go, page 310, I believe. What does this mean? The best way to truly obtain and to keep the beloved child long promised by God is to offer him or her up to the Spirit that calls to the adventure of life. That is the eternal counsel of the wise. That is the logos that eternally broods over the potential and is endlessly deep. In essence, you give up the son so that you can get him back even greater, right? And there's Peterson's point here is more parentally ordered. And so in psychoanalysis, there's what's called the Oedipus complex. And in the Oedipus complex, there's, to quote Zizek, to reduce to the utmost, right? Like what's going on here is, in essence, think of the baby and the mother. That the mother is always going to be overwhelmingly doting on the baby, and her entire existence becomes ordered around the baby. And so the baby ultimately gets this wrong impression that the world really revolves around the baby, right? And it's this smothering aspect of the mother that ultimately needs to be parted. So the Jungian way of saying this, the parting, is to say that the good mother is one who ultimately fails, right? She fails to perfectly create the loving, doting world for the baby. And so hardship will eventually break in and the baby will have to struggle to develop. But the sort of more Lacanian sense or the Freudian sense is going to be along the lines of there's what's called the no of the father, which is that a buddy of mine actually gave me this example that he and his wife have a couple of young babies, basically, or young kids, toddlers. And one of them was saying, hey, can I come and sleep with you guys tonight? And the mom was like, yeah, you can come. And then Kyle turns around and goes, no, you can't. And it's a perfect example of the no of the father. The father comes along and there's this literal unity of the mother and the child there. The father comes along and says, no, you're not doing this. I'm not having you in my bed, kid, basically. So there's this no of the father that separates the mother and the child, right? And the thing is, depending on either reading, the point is development requires breaking with that perfectly smothering, all encapsulating drive of the mother to basically take care of the child. And so Peterson interprets this as you ultimately have to sacrifice the child, i.e. give them up to the Spirit, and rather than basically smother them with your doting and kindness to them. There's a Switchfoot song that I really like called "Do You Love Me Enough to Let Me Go?" And I think that's probably the best way to just summarize the point, that the successful parent is going to love them enough to let them go, to give them over to the Spirit and let that Spirit guide them rather than ultimately just the parent. So that's his reading. So Abraham sacrificing Isaac is sort of put in that category, that's really what it's read as. If you've watched our Kierkegaard episodes, you know that Kierkegaard himself very much doesn't agree with that take on Abraham and Isaac, but that's too much to get into right now. If you're interested, we have a whole episode on this. But a couple of points real quick. There's the line that he says in an interview that the Bible is ultimately about us, finds itself also stated here on page 309. He says the Bible is ultimately about us, and if it's not, then who is it about? Now, the Protestant in me wants to say, well, Jesus. It's about Jesus. It's about God. That's who it's about. It's not about us. It's about him, right? But still, it's an interesting rhetorical question because there's the point of if there's a practical application that's demanded of every biblical text, then guess what? We have automatically conditioned ourselves to see the Bible as fundamentally about us because it's got to be practically applied to our lives or it's meaningless, right? So Peterson is operating very much, given that practical applications are what everybody demands in church today, Peterson is completely in line with the current spirit of the church. Now, the next point, though, is what is salvation? And he has an interesting line where he even at the end starts breaking down Jesus' salvation. And the salvation on page 314 is in essence this rightly raised kind of familial type of salvation, right? Like you're ensuring the better development of your posterity, which again, with the meaningless, everything is meaningless claim of Ecclesiastes, I'm not entirely sure that really would matter at the end, right? Because what about Ecclesiastes? That would be, again, my fundamental question. Yes, this is about development. This is about growing into the fullness of life insofar as we can have the fullness of life on this side of eternity. But the noteworthy thing is there's two different senses of the fullness of life. Today, in our kind of post-existentialist world, what we think of when we think of as the fullness of life is the maximization of good experiences in this limited, finite sense of life. If you go back to the ancient sources, what you have rather a little bit more commonly is that the fullness of life would actually be being united with the principle of life, i.e. God, right? And then not dying precisely because of that, right? Your sustenance is God there. And so you have an eternal life precisely because you are linked with him. Augustine says this, for example, in the first several chapters of book 14 of the City of God, wherein he's talking about how the angels have that kind of life because they're perfectly linked with him, with God, and that we too can become like the angels when we are brought to God. He's saying not that we become generically like the angels, but rather that we become functionally like the angels in the sense that we are unified with the source of our life, God, and no longer being separated from him. We no longer die and pass away. We are perfectly unified with the Father. And so Peterson's fullness of life that Jesus ultimately is pointing us to, which would be the salvation of life, would be, again, I think, a kind of maximization of the human experience in this dying world. Whereas, again, I would argue that the Bible itself has a different orientation, that the fullness of life is being fully united with the principle of life and therefore not dying. So that's my summary of chapter 6, and I'll leave it to you if you want any comments.
Yeah, great job. I mean, that's a big task. Chapter 6 covers a lot of territory. I mean, this is definitely the largest section of text that Peterson's tackled so far. This is Genesis 12 through 35, so a huge chunk of scripture. And it's not just about the events in Abraham's life, as you pointed out, but he kind of jumps over the story of Isaac and gets into the Jacob-Esau saga. The only thing that I would add is that I think, let's say the heart of the Petersonian project, I think occurs on page 292. And this is the story of Jacob. You really focused in on the ladder to heaven aspect, which is definitely a recurring theme motif. Yeah. But here specifically, he talks about the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel, which turns out to be God. So this is a theophany, an appearance of God in humanoid form. So the story is that Jacob is he leaves his father-in-law, he sets out on his own, he's returning to his homeland, and he's going to encounter his brother Esau, who he had basically tricked out of his birthright. And Esau just obviously pissed Esau off, and there was enmity between Esau and Jacob for many years, at least 14 years, while Jacob and his family were away. So they're coming back. The night before he's supposed to meet Esau, again, an angel appears, wrestles with Jacob all night long. And this is the transformative episode in Jacob's life. And it's from this where he gets a new name, Israel. So his name goes from Jacob to Israel. So Peterson focuses in on this on page 292. And I think he gives us here the clearest conception of what he means by wrestling with God, which is the book title. And I think it's worth reading. So it's just a couple lines here on page 292. Peterson writes, quote, Jacob, of course, wrestles with God, as we all do when we face the most difficult of decisions. What path will we choose? What will we allow or call upon to guide us What spirit will possess us in our decision? So, as I argued in the beginning of this series, I think to wrestle with God for Peterson is to make the choice to align ourselves or to refuse to align ourselves with the spirit or the process of upward aiming in the collective universal psyche. I think that's exactly what Peterson means here. Obviously, this is, surprise, surprise, a psychologized understanding of what's going on in this passage. And then what he says on the next page, I think, helps us understand what is the goal, what is the end of our wrestling with the divine. And that goal or that end is, on page 293, you can clearly see it's psychological integration. It's wholeness. It's the possession of a integrated identity. And I would argue, as I argued at the beginning of this series, that what you have here is just an echo of this Jungian idea of individuation, that the real purpose in life, the road to well-being, is individuation. It is bringing together the various aspects of our psyche, both of those that we are consciously aware of and those parts of the collective unconscious, bringing them into unity, what Peterson would call a monotheistic unity. So anyway, that's the only thing I would add here, is that on page 292, if you are looking for the explanation, the meaning of this phrase, to wrestle with God, wrestling with God, we who wrestle with God, it's right there on page 292 with the story of Jacob, where Peterson gets the title for this book.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
That's ultimately really about all I've got in terms of this passage, other than I do want to read, well, actually I don't want to read it. I don't want to take too long here. I do want to stress one other point, which is the living in the truth. There is a discourse in, I guess you might call it postmodern philosophy, about the hyperreal, which is to say that we prefer now the copy rather than the original. And in fact, that we don't even prefer the copy so much as we prefer the copy of the copy of the copy of the copy. And we're so many derivations away from the original that we're not even satisfying ourselves with the original anymore. And this is an idea that originally is brought about by Ludwig Feuerbach in the second preface to his book, The Essence of Christianity. And he makes this point where that we prefer the copy to the original, but the thing in the term is simulacrum that people use today. And if you view society as essentially this simulacrum type reality, or rather this procession of simulacra, basically, that we are satisfying ourselves never with the original, but always with the copies. To live in the truth, in essence, would be to turn away from all of the false claims to truth in the present, which is an interesting and difficult task, which would be, in essence, I think, the sacrificial movement that Peterson's talking about in the opening of the text. But I was reading the book of Enoch this week, and there's a line that you see it in the New Testament, you see it in the Old Testament as well, you see it in a lot of ancient literature, where near the end, it's the final part of the book, the sinners, the way of the sinners, is those who lay deceit as a foundation. If you have that version of the book, that's page 118. But it's lay deceit as a foundation. And I'm pretty certain, I haven't actually confirmed this, but I'm pretty certain that you could also translate that as have a deceitful foundation, in the sense of what's being stressed is a foundation that promises security, but ultimately is, again, evanescent. Because what Enoch then points to is wealth, right? This point of sort of wealth as being the thing that brings that security. And he moves into then warfare and so forth as well. But what I found kind of interesting is that, having read that, and then, going back and rereading Peterson here, the point that Peterson was making with Sodom and Gomorrah is particularly important, I think, in relation to those with whom he is often associated. Because there's a kind of, I hate to call him a self-help guru, but there's a kind of 21st century young man's self-help guru kind of phenomenon that has occurred in the present. Namely, that there's guys like, the Tate brothers, whatever they are. Was it Andrew Tate, I think?
I just know Andrew. I don't know what his brother's name is.
Yeah. So there's Andrew Tate, basically, and there's all those who, for them, there's a lot of people that I know who love both Peterson and guys like the Tate brothers. Now, Peterson has criticized Andrew Tate to the extreme. Andrew Tate likes to talk about, break free from the matrix, which would be kind of like break free from the simulacrum or the procession of simulacra. But the solution is break free from that so that then you can find the true ways to sort of appreciate a kind of hedonistic lifestyle, or rather acquire a kind of hedonistic lifestyle, right? Whereas the Petersonian version is precisely the opposite, right? Don't turn to a foundation of deceitfulness, which would be wealth that will evanesce inevitably, right? Don't turn to something like that, but turn to something that has lasting value. And while I theologically resist the idea of what he's pointing to as lasting value as being the kind of eternal value that Christianity is pointing us to, there is no doubt that the moral sense of the text here that he's elevating, or I shouldn't put it that way. If we approach this just from the standpoint of a moral meaning, that there's infinite wisdom in what he's pointing out. That a self-centered life is not one that will ever bring happiness, but will actually move you ever farther and farther away from any kind of satisfaction or fulfillment. And so, in this sense, what he's preaching here couldn't be farther from the sort of alternative that is pretty commonly associated with these young men self-help guru kind of identities. And so it's a really profound message that he's pointing to, and one that really needs to be, I think, reiterated again and again.
Yeah. So lots of great stuff there in chapter 6. All right, we're kind of turning on third base here, and a couple more stories to consider. Next up is Moses, and that's 2 chapters worth. So we'll take a look at what Peterson has to say from the Moses accounts in the Bible, and then I think he's going to end with Jonah. So join us next time. Again, we'll be looking at chapters 7 and 8, and we'll see you then.